This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
More Sudan's Sovereign Council members sworn in as transition begins. Uganda and Rwanda agreed to restore economic and political ties. And South African artist creates color-splashed art by fusing artwork and design. Hello and welcome to Africa Live on CGTN with me, Beatrice Marshall, in Nairobi. The details on those stories in just a moment, but first, Uche Okoronkwo with the day's business headlines. Uche.
Thank you, Beatrice. And here's a look at what's coming up on Africa Live Biz. South African budget retailer Mr. Price sees its sales drop as the country battles economic pressures. And Egypt reviews its mining laws to attract investors. Of course, all that coming up within the program. For now, back to you, Beatrice.
Uche, thank you. And let's begin in Libya, where a foreign minister of the internationally recognized government of National Accord now says the humanitarian and security situation is alarming and the number of victims are increasing in the country. Speaking while in Tunisia, Mohamed Tahar further says the assault on Tripoli has had a negative impact on the Libyan economy. Thousands of Libyan families have escaped to neighboring Tunisia.
Tunisian Foreign Minister Ahmed Jinawi received his Libyan counterpart Mohamed Tahar. They discussed the latest developments on the ground.
Unfortunately, the war continues between brothers in Libya. This is unacceptable to Tunisia and neighboring countries. Tunisia still supports the initiative of our late president to help Libyans overcome their differences and reach a political settlement instead of military escalation.
The Libyan foreign minister and the government of National Accord noted that the UN and other partners are seeking to bring all Libyans to the negotiating table and to resume negotiations.
The 3+3 meeting will be held in Europe on Friday. There have been growing efforts by the UN envoy Ghassan Salameh, who was in Tripoli, to inform the Tunisian side of the situation. We are confident that Tunisia is one of the most concerned countries about the Libyan crisis.
CLA revealed that some countries have blocked the political process and favored war at the expense of dialogue between Libyans.
Libya and Tunisia have the same concerns. We've talked about the countries that support the Libyan cause and others that oppose any solution in Libya. We call on Libya's partners to help end the aggressive attitude.
Experts in Libyan affairs assert that the number of victims and casualties in Tripoli has increased as a result of airstrikes by planes and drones, indiscriminate rocket attacks and shelling, and direct fighting on the ground. Over 20,000 Libyan families have entered Tunisia since the beginning of the conflict. Tunisian interim president Mohamed al-Nasser stressed the importance of continuing efforts within the framework of a tripartite initiative of Tunis, Cairo and Algiers to boost the political process and to put an end to violence which is ravaging the North African country. Adnan Shawishi, CGTN, Tunis.
Uganda and Rwanda have agreed to restore economic and political ties, ending a 6-month deadlock. The two countries have been at loggerheads over security concerns. This led to the closure of the border post at Katuna, slowing down trade. CGTN's Hilary Ayesiga reports.
Presidents Yoweri Museveni and Paul Kagame signed a pact to end tensions between their two countries.
I had already been in touch with President Kagame through our own channels, but this was like a reinforcement.
Key issues in the agreement include respect for the sovereignty of each country, protecting the rights and freedoms of the nationals in either country, and the free movement of people and goods.
Rwanda's commitment to implementing or following the guidelines that will help us overcome a number of difficulties. I think we are not going to be found wanting.
But experts say it takes more than signing the peace accord.
Would the signing of this peace accord resolve that long-standing mutual distrust between the two countries? If we don't resolve that problem, that underlying problem that gives rise to episodes of conflicts now and again, then this peace accord will mean nothing.
This is not the first time the two countries are having major disagreements. In 1999, they had a brutal confrontation in DRC, costing lives. But the two countries' leaders say they can put aside their recent differences. Hilary Isga, CGTN, Kampala.
Meanwhile, Uganda plans to roll out a mass immunization against measles following an outbreak in the country. The campaign, funded by the World Health Organization, will cover children between the ages of 9 months to 15 years. Over $10 million will be spent on the immunization program. Isabel Nakiria reports.
Uganda's Minister of Health says the campaign will target more than 8 million children. Local council leaders and village health teams will move door to door to ensure that all children receive the jab.
Our measles vaccination coverage is about 85%, and so some of the districts that are really low in coverage always have these outbreaks coming up. And so the aim of this mass vaccination is to interrupt the current outbreak that has affected over 65 districts.
The WHO recommends 97% coverage of immunization against measles. The Ministry of Health says measles can be fatal, and it is important that all children get the booster doses.
And as you know, the complications of measles kill. Usually the pneumonia, the diarrhea that comes with the measles is quite bad, and the children pass away. And so it is important that we interrupt this current outbreak to ensure that our children remain safe and alive.
Children will also be immunized against polio. The government says an outbreak of polio in neighboring Somalia could easily spill over into Uganda. Isabel Nakiria, CGTN, Kampala.
To Sudan now, where the Sovereign Council members took oath on Wednesday as the country's governing bodies fill their vacancies. Economist Abdallah Hamdok has been sworn in as interim president, but as the nation's leadership takes form, tension between opposition groups and the military may become a major obstacle in the application of an optimistic transitional path to elections. Here's Adel Mahroui with more on that.
Abdel Fattah al-Burhan takes oath as the head of the Sudanese Sovereign Council, the highest body in the nation's 3 years transitional period. He has officially become an agreed-upon figure to lead Sudan, but instead of reflecting stability, the appointment of the council showed a threatening division to Sudan's future.
Division among the Freedom and Change Alliance is beginning to unfold. There have been internal rejections to the nominated people to the Sovereign Council, whose formation was forced to be delayed. Looking at the nature of the relationship between the civilians and the military leadership, the mistrust between the two persists. It was clear when they had to bring in a figure for both to approve to the council to be a decisive vote in case of a deadlock.
Abdallah Hamdok has been also sworn in as interim Prime Minister of Sudan. As a leading figure in the UN Economic Commission for Africa, he is a well-connected figure who is capable of bringing international support to his nation's economy. However, experts believe he might not be entirely free to enforce his policies.
Sudan wants to present a friendly face who would reflect the change Sudan wants so it can be lifted from the terror list and end sanctions imposed. The Prime Minister will also be challenged with the political disputes between the military, the civilian powers, and the private sector, which will seek more market freedoms as they've enjoyed during the last few months.
We are capable of overcoming the economic challenges. That was among Hamdok's first words as Prime Minister. But without the Sovereign Council's full support, he may be trying to lead the cabinet with tied hands. With the military institution, the police and armed groups under the direct management of the military-led Sovereign Council, the interim Prime Minister is going to need their full support to implement his policies and regulations. Any differences between the two could produce unwanted obstacles in Sudan's transitional roadmap. Adel Mahroui, CGTN, Cairo.
Meanwhile, the ushering in of a Prime Minister and the Sovereign Council is expected to help steer the country to growth. Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok is expected to form a government of 20 ministers to be selected by the Opposition Freedom and Change Alliance on August the 28th.
The swearing-in of Sudan's new Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok and other council members is seen as a further step in transition towards civilian rule.
The revolution's deep-rooted slogan, freedom, peace and justice, will form the program of the transitional period. Allow me to accomplish the central demands. The number one priority is to stop the war and build permanent peace. We are working to alleviate the suffering of our people in refugee camps. Stopping the war will also depend on resolving the dire economic crisis and building a national economy based on productivity and not on blessings and donations.
Hamdok's appointment comes as the outgoing head of the military council, General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, was sworn in as a leader of the new Sovereign Council. The body will run the country for 3 years, until an election after decades of autocratic rule. It replaces the Transitional Military Council that took charge after months of deadly street protests brought down the Islamist ruler in April. The new rulers, however, have the in-tray full. It includes pushing for the lifting of the country's suspension from the Africa Union and from the US list of state sponsors of terrorism. The other daunting challenges that await the rulers include reviving the economy and unifying a country still plagued by unrest in regions. Chamgono, CGTN.
Egyptian Chinese naval forces began a maritime exercise within the boundaries of the Northern Maritime Fleet in the Mediterranean Sea. The training features several Egyptian warships and the Chinese destroyer Xian 153. Egypt's military spokesman Tamer al-Rifai said the two countries' naval forces received training to handle terrorist threats and piracy. The forces also were trained in the inspection of suspicious ships, transportation, signaling exercises, and several sailing formations designed for day and night time. The exercise aims to unify operational concepts, educate forces on the various combat doctrines, and exchange expertise. Well, CGTN's Adel Mahroui is joining me now for more on this story live from Cairo. Adel, Egyptian and Chinese naval forces carried out joint military drills off Egypt's Mediterranean coast. What more can you tell us?
Well, basically, it's part of an enhanced military cooperation that has been ongoing for both countries for many years. Specifically, since the Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi came to office, he has significantly boosted the bilateral military relations between Cairo and Beijing. Both nations in many occasions have met. Military officials from both sides have also met to discuss how to cooperate to combat terrorism, to engage with non-conventional threats in the Middle East and other parts. Egypt and China together have been enhancing their bilateral relations into strategic comprehensive partnership, which means that the two countries will be supporting each other in whatever threat the other is fighting. And it comes along these lines to enhance the capabilities of other, to learn from one another as significant naval powers in the region as Egypt and in the world as China. Together there's a lot of information exchange and tactical exchange that both can cooperate and share together.
So, Adel, Egypt has carried out similar exercises with a host of other countries. What is different this time around, and what exactly is the aim of these exercises?
Well, Beatrice, you just mentioned that China's naval destroyer, Xian 153, was among the Chinese naval warships in this exercise. To Egypt, for instance, it's a great exposure to watch, monitor, and see the maneuvers of such Chinese technologies and powers in the area of military naval forces and how to engage in general in an area like the Mediterranean. They've both worked together along the jurisdiction of the Northern Naval Fleet together to have more of an orientation and increase the awareness over the geographic nature of that part in the Mediterranean Sea north of Egypt. It is a significant step, and it's quite different from the rest. Egypt has been used to see military exercises with many other countries, but with China it's always different, as the recognition to China as a strong partner to the Egyptian side. It's not also the first time that the two countries hold the same or a similar naval exercise. The last naval exercise was in 2015, so about 4 years ago. Also, earlier this year, we've seen the Egyptian Defense Minister Mohammed Zaki receive his Chinese counterpart Wei Fenghe, and together they have been discussing and putting a plan actually to have a clear vision on how both countries can engage militarily and enhance each other's tactics.
Adel Mahroui joining us there from Cairo. Thank you. Kenya is now scaling up its lobbying for international support in its efforts to win a seat in the crucial UN Security Council. The country's bid to succeed South Africa was boosted by a win at the African Union over Djibouti. Here's more on that story.
Kenya beat Djibouti after garnering 37 votes. Kenya is seeking to replace South Africa in representing Eastern Africa as a non-permanent member of the crucial United Nations Security Council. South Africa's tenure ends in 2020. If Kenya wins this seat, it will then join Niger, which represents Western Africa, and Tunisia from the north in completing Africa's representation in the Security Council. For Kenya to win this seat, it must garner at least 129 votes out of the 193 total members of the General Assembly. This is what Kenya's Foreign Minister Monica Juma and the Kenyan leadership will be looking to push for as they embark on winning support from the international community. The United Nations Security Council has 5 permanent members, which are United States, Russia, China, France, and the United Kingdom. The organ is central in implementing key mandates of the UN, including peacekeeping missions. Non-permanent members are elected to represent different regions. Until 1965, the top UN organ had 6 members. However, the number was increased up to 10 after an amendment that saw more countries considered. The first non-permanent member of the United Nations Security Council were Australia, Brazil, Netherlands, Mexico, and Egypt. African countries that have represented the continent for the term that runs between 2018 and 2021 include Cote d'Ivoire, Equatorial Guinea, South Africa, Niger, and Tunisia. Whether Kenya will join the team in flying the African flag at the council, only time will tell. Daniel Arab Moy, CGTN.
Well, earlier we spoke to Dr. Mustafa Ali, the chairman of the Horn International Institute for Strategic Studies, who explains what the win will mean for Kenya, that is, if it happens.
This means that Kenya is now the preferred candidate for Africa at the United Nations Security Council. It means that Kenya is assured of most votes from Africa, and those are the states or countries that are friends to Africa when they will be voting for this position at the United Nations General Assembly. It means that Kenya, and of course to an extent the other African countries, have a leverage over what is discussed at the United Nations Security Council. It means they can influence the agenda, the processes. African countries were given that category to be a part of the Security Council after 1963. Before 1963, there was no category of an African state or African states. Then, you know, African issues were just on the menu to be picked or to be relegated. But now we have some African states at the table. That means that they're able to bring issues of terrorism, security, peace, and security to the United Nations organ that actually make decisions.
You're watching Africa Live, still ahead on the program. Nigeria's government close to attaining polio-free status. And the UN warns against drought linked to climate change in South Sudan.
Horse racing in Mauritius is like a shocker in Europe, you know.
You keep learning every day in this game. No one can say that he knows all. There is this saying in racing that good horses make good jockeys. I believe good horses make also good trainers.
You know, horses are very lovely animals. You have to connect with them, you know, or else we wouldn't be doing it. And the hard work that we put into the horses, yeah, you have to, a lot of it's love.
I love them as my kids. For horse, for kids, same. I give them same care, same love, same affection.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
Nigeria is close to attaining a polio-free status after marking 3 years since its last reported case of wild poliovirus. Health experts say it is a significant milestone that could lead to the entire continent being declared polio-free. Before now, Nigeria had held the unenviable record of being one of 3 countries in the world where the polio disease is still endemic. Here's Dejim Badmus.
The news is a very big deal for Nigeria if you consider the fact that just about 7 months ago, the country accounted for more than half of the world's polio cases. But with no report of a single case of the wild polio virus since 2016, Nigeria is now on the verge of being declared polio-free.
This is a monumental achievement towards the health and well-being of children throughout the country. It has been a hard, long, and at times trying road to reach this milestone, but one that has been worth every step. And we as UNICEF are proud to be an integral part of this journey with the government of Nigeria and all other partners.
Nigeria's battle against the polio virus had been seriously hindered by the Boko Haram insurgency in the country's northeast, where the last case of the virus was reported in 2016. Health workers had found it almost impossible to access the area for vaccination. But with the military succeeding in beating back the insurgents over the past 3 years, the situation has since changed, with health workers able to vaccinate many more under 5 children than before. Authorities had also massively scaled up the polio vaccination program across the country as well, reaching an unprecedented number of children.
Despite this significant progress, ending all forms of polio across the region remains an unfinished success story. The low immunization rates pose a major risk to other forms of polio virus outbreaks. Furthermore, inaccessibility to some children pose also a threat to sustain the recent gains.
Their warnings health authorities in Nigeria are taking very seriously, pledging not to let down their guards.
Polio campaigns will therefore continue in the current tempo and intensity to ensure that children and our environment are protected against all types of the polio virus, while further strengthening routine immunization against vaccine-preventable diseases. The implementation of Immunization Plus Days, IPDs, where we deliver oral polio vaccines to children under 5 years of age, irrespective of their immunization status, will continue even beyond 2020. This is aimed at boosting the population immunity in order to maintain polio WPV-free status.
If Nigeria could sustain or even scale up its current effort in the fight against the disease and remain without a single case of polio over the next few months, the World Health Organization would officially declare the country polio-free. And that, in turn, could set the entire continent on the path of being declared polio-free as well. Deji Badmos, CGTN, Lagos.
African governments are increasingly looking at ways of reducing over-reliance on hydroelectricity from the national grid, which currently does not match demand. Here in Kenya, the use of biogas is expanding to include not only households, but also businesses and large institutions seeking to meet their energy costs. CGTN's Daniel Arap-Moy brings us more.
International, regional and national stakeholders meeting in Nairobi are working towards supporting the biodigester sector in Kenya. Under the theme, Investing in Biodigester Technology for a Greener Economic Transformation, Experts echoed the need for innovative mechanisms that can help families access clean and affordable energy.
We need to emphasize on training. When proper training is done, you can be sure we are going to have proper awareness and the product will be able to be pushed up.
Kenya is currently working towards a commercially viable domestic biogas sector that would contribute towards food security, clean, sustainable use of energy and environmental conservation. Rose Kiarie is a resident of Kiambu and one among an increasing number of Kenyan dairy farmers who are turning to green energy to power their farms. Kiarie is using the gas generated using cow dung to power her farm and light her home, cook food in the kitchen and boil water in the bathroom.
I don't use electricity to boil bath in water. I use biogas to boil my water. I also use biogas to boil water for cooking, so it really helps me a lot.
We ventured into biogas as a pilot project with 300 women at Kamwetu Cooperative Society, and the lives seem to have changed a lot in the last 3 years.
Kiarie mixes water and cow dung from the dairy unit, which is put into a biodigester from where it's broken down to produce methane. She also uses the waste from the biogas unit to grow her crops, including maize and mangoes, making the dairy enterprise a very profitable venture. Sub-Saharan Africa continues to suffer from a major energy crisis, with hundreds of millions of people lacking access to electricity and clean cooking fuels. The Kenyan Biogas now envisions all Kenyan households accessing and utilizing green energy for their homes and organic fertilizer for their farm as one of the ways of protecting the environment. But challenges still remain, as many find the initial installation cost expensive. Daniel Arab Moi, CGTN, Nairobi, Kenya.
Cairo has declared a state of emergency due to a decline in water flow from last year. Annual water level measurements are announced in August every year. According to a government statement, a state of emergency means keeping all of the water ministry's departments on maximum alert to periodically follow up on the water situation in the main riverbed, all canals and water channels in the governorates. As Yasser Hakim reports, the state is trying to provide enough water to cover the needs for drinking and domestic use.
The Ministry of Water Supply has been on high alert to deal with the loss of over 5 billion cubic meters of water because of the low Nile flood levels. Experts say, however, that Egypt's water share of the Nile has not been significantly reduced. The problem is that water consumption is increasing annually because of the rapid population growth. Egypt needs 114 billion cubic meters of water per year, and what's available is less than half that amount. The North African country has been listed as one of the states suffering from extreme water poverty.
The water waste in Cairo alone is over 1 million cubic meters per day because of the wrong attitude by citizens, such as washing cars using water hoses in the streets and water abuse in gardening and agriculture. There is also the rundown plumbing in state-owned schools and government offices. We are working on fixing the infrastructure of these facilities and placing photo cells to avoid water leakage.
The Nile is the main source of water for Egypt. Now the government is trying to create new sources of clean water.
There
are important water recycling projects which save a lot of water, especially in agriculture, the Delta and Upper Egypt. There are also huge desalination projects underway in the Red Sea, Sinai, and the north coast of the Mediterranean Sea. It's an aggressive plan to produce clean drinking water.
There's been an extensive awareness campaign for farmers in water conservation.
The government is working with farmers to reduce the cultivation of rice because it's a high water consuming crop. They are replacing it with other low consuming crops and penalizing farmers who break the rules. They also train farmers on modern irrigation methods to save water.
Strict laws have also been put in place to prohibit water waste.
The new law slaps a hefty fine of 2,000 to 20,000 Egyptian pounds on individuals, depending on each case. More fines on companies and industries.
In ancient Egypt, August was a month of celebrating the Nile floods every year, but lately it has become a period of concern, as water scarcity is a growing threat to people's lives. Yas Hakim for CGTN, Cairo.
And now in Hong Kong, where violent protests have given way to a peaceful sit-in by high school students. Earlier on Wednesday, some protesters clashed with the police during a rally wearing masks and helmets. The protesters gathered at the suburban Yuen Long MTR station. Some blocked the exits and roads leading to the station, pointing laser pens at shield-bearing officers. Local police said they had no choice but to use restrained force to disperse the protesters after repeated warnings. Well, our reporter Shu Dan asked the former Hong Kong chief prosecutor about the legal aspects of the ongoing protests and the penalty violent rioters are facing.
According to a report by World Justice Project, a US-based independent research organization, Hong Kong is ranked 16th in the world in terms of its rule of law. It's also ranked 4th worldwide in terms of order and security, and the crime rate is also one of the lowest in the world. Does this suggest that Hong Kong police are doing a very good job in maintaining law and order? What does it mean for Hong Kong?
Well, Hong Kong has traditionally been a very safe city. I mean, it's projected itself as Asia's world city, a place that's safe to visit, and tourists have come here from all over the world. But unfortunately, in very recent times, Hong Kong is acquiring a reputation as a place which has a lawlessness in some respects. And let me explain that to you. Because the government has recently been forced to shelve its extradition proposals, this means that Hong Kong is in effect becoming a safe haven from criminals from not only other parts of China, but also from around the world. They can come here and claim safe haven, and they can't be sent back for trial in the jurisdictions where they allegedly committed their crimes. So that is one area where lawlessness is showing itself. And the other area, of course, is in relation to the ongoing protests. All sorts of crime, every type of crime, very grave crimes, are being committed on a regular basis by extremists who are associated with the protest movement. And of course, that is damaging Hong Kong's reputation considerably, and it is deterring a lot of tourists and conference organizers and other people from visiting Hong Kong because they no longer regard it as a safe place. And this is undoubtedly part and parcel of the movement to undermine Hong Kong's legal system and its way of life.
A chief superintendent of Hong Kong police told me that his family was verbally abused, especially his 13-year-old daughter, who was told by his sports coach that what her father is doing is disgusting. And this is just one example of how the police are facing different kinds of bullying from society. What is behind this?
Well, obviously there are concerted attempts to undermine the morale of the police force. It's being done physically by attacks on the streets, by Molotov cocktails being thrown at them, by their police stations being attacked. But there was also another campaign being mounted against them, and this is very much a psychological campaign. We saw it, for example, when the activists, the fanatics, stole the personal details of 2,000 police officers and their families, and then posted them online. This caused a great deal of dismay and concern for many police families because their personal information was being abused in that way. Another example, of course, arose on the night of August 3rd, 4th, when a mob actually went to the homes of the police officers when the families were there, the children were sleeping, and they threw bricks and used lasers at those premises in order to try to terrorize the police officers' families. So a psychological war is being mounted against them, in addition to the physical attacks which are taking place week in and week out. So it's a very, very difficult time for the police. Even their children are sometimes being abused in the schools. So this is a terrible time for the police, and it's absolutely vital that everyone in Hong Kong not only recognises this, but rallies around the police force at this very difficult time and gives them maximum support. Well, it is very well organised, yes. I mean, the leaders of this movement pretend that it is a leaderless movement, but that's clearly not the case. When the mobs are in action, one can see chains of command in operation, one can see chains of supply, one can see that direction is being given, plans are being laid well in advance, warnings are being given which areas are going to be targeted day in, day out. As I say, someone is financing these anti-police advertisements which are being put in newspapers in countries around the world. This is very well organised, and it would be foolish to pretend otherwise.
Well, let's now go to Uche Okoronkwo for the latest in business news. Uche.
Thanks, Beatrice. And coming up on Africa Live Biz. South African budget retailer Mr. Price sees its sales drop as the country battles economic pressures. And Egypt reviews its mining laws to attract investors.
Business in Africa is at the crossroads, where opportunity meets innovation, where profitable new markets collide with global trends. From the sound of an African bell on a stock market's floor to the shout of the trader in a bustling free market, it's colorful, vibrant, and exotic. CGTN stands at the gateway to Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. From Morocco to South Africa, we talk to the deal makers and actors who fuel its engines of growth. Only on CGTN.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
Well, let's start off in South Africa. Budget retailer Mr. Price posted a 2.5% drop in comparable store sales for the first 4 months of its financial year. Now, the South African retail company has recently come from a low for 18 weeks. That's its shares. This has been attributed to a tough retail environment in the country, highlighted by a constrained consumer spending. Of course, Mr. Price added that a detailed review of its merchandise process was expected to benefit performance in the second half, and that its winter inventory was cleared to accepted levels. Now, group retail sales over the period inched about 0.6% higher, but rose 3.6% in the last 2 weeks of that period. Meanwhile, Egypt's government has issued a new natural resources law after repeated complaints from its business community. The latest incentive is part of the North African economy's strategy to attract more investments as it tries to make optimum use of its available natural resources. Here's CGTN's Yasser Hakim with the story.
A new authority will be set up in charge of licensing mines and quarries instead of governorates to speed up the process and cut on red tape. This is one of several incentives aimed at attracting more investments to the mineral resources sector.
The most important aspect, in my opinion, is that licensing is issued by the Ministry of Petroleum for quarries and minerals. As for hold licenses, they come directly from the Minister of Petroleum with simple procedures to prove the seriousness of the investor. This was a major demand from the private sector.
The government is trying to make optimum use of the natural resources available in the country.
Egypt produces huge quantities of phosphate, and there's a major project to excavate and market it internationally. There are also many quarries for all types of granite, but the most profitable is gold. In spite of the huge reserves of gold, we only have one gold mine in Egypt called El Sokari. With the new law, I expect gold mining to flourish and create considerable revenue.
The government has also scrapped the production sharing agreements with the private sector. It has replaced it with royalties on value of production capped at 20%. The government hopes that the new law would encourage more investments in the mining and quarry sectors and would bring in abundance of revenue, especially from gold and phosphate. Yes, Hakim for CGTN, Cairo.
Now, private business leaders in Africa are ahead of their global counterparts when it comes to digital change. That is according to a PricewaterhouseCoopers survey, which interviewed senior executives from about 2,900 private businesses in 53 countries in Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. Now, 81% of its respondents across 9 key economies on the continent said they see digitalization as highly relevant to their future. That's compared with about 65% in Europe. And a greater proportion in Africa say they want to allocate more than 5% of their overall planned investments into digital compared with peers elsewhere. Here's CGTN's Angelo Coppola, who spoke to Gert Allen about the survey.
So where are these African business leaders going to be focusing on in terms of digitalization?
First one is on the why, because if they want to compete with their counterparts in Europe, that is the opportunity to do so. And on what, it will be on the main ones. We talk about the 8, so artificial intelligence, AR, and also robotics and data analytics.
Now, besides artificial intelligence and virtual reality, which are the other technologies that these business leaders brought to the fore in the survey?
Internet of Things, that is the smart devices that will be connected to that and the data flow between that. The blockchain, because of the financial systems that are not as advanced as in the rest of the world. I would say those are the main ones.
Now, it's great news that the business leaders are looking at these technologies to help their businesses grow, but isn't there a disconnect with the skills levels that are needed, and do we have that pool?
One of the biggest challenges that private businesses are facing is skilled people to take this digitalization forward in their businesses. For the short term, it will definitely be to actually reach out to startups in the technology and digitalization businesses and partner with them, and through that develop the skill pool for the market.
And heading to Mozambique now, the country's president, Filipe Nyusi, says talks with the International Monetary Fund are making encouraging progress. Now, the IMF has been in talks with the cash-strapped country to restore its access to international financing. Mozambique has been battling to recover from a debt crisis after admitting to a $1.4 billion of previously undisclosed lending in 2016, prompting the IMF to cut off its support. Now, Nyusi said in July, after the ruling, that Mozambique was committed to respecting international laws on debt. Back in June, Mozambique's finance ministry said the country had reached a restructuring deal in principle with holders of its defaulted 2023 bond. The IMF welcomed that agreement, but said the heavily indebted country needed a wider-ranging plan to ensure long-term debt sustainability. And the ongoing trade friction between economic powerhouses China and the United States has drawn the attention of South Africa's media circle. Now, experts in the country believe that America's plans to impose a 10% tariff on some $300 billion worth of Chinese imports will lead to a global crisis. According to Iqbal Serve, the executive chairman of South Africa's independent media group, the trade dispute between the world's top 2 economies will not only affect relations between the two sides. Serve says the ongoing friction will ultimately affect the integration and flow of the international financial system.
I think it's bad when you disregard global rules. I think when you do that, you create a situation of chaos. And it can take you a short while to withdraw, but the consequences of withdrawal could be there for many, many, many years to come. And to get the US to be integrated back into the system again will have long-term consequences for global trade. My view is that President Trump has gone against the tenets of global free trade by imposing these tariffs on China unilaterally. And anything that goes against the rules of free trade and the rules in the way the trade operates and the markets operate in the world is only going to send us backwards. And so I think he has not thought through what he's doing. It has a huge impact, not just on the bilateral relationships between China and the US. It has a global impact because the trade that happens between those countries also affects other countries.
Well, that's all for now on Africa Live Biz. But coming up on Global Business Africa, South Africa's new debt relief law continues to draw mixed reactions in the country, but experts are saying it may not be as harmful to investors. Of course, we'll be delving further into this top of the hour. For now, back to you, Beatrice.
Uche, thank you. And we still have more news for you here on the program. Here's what's ahead. A South African artist creates color splashed art by fusing artwork and design.
The greatest journeys, the greatest sights, the greatest adventures.
Here in Kanata, this weir allows the locals to walk on water.
We're far more than just TV news. We're your passport to the wonders of Africa.
To bring you stories of struggle, survival and hope.
So let's explore. CGTN. See the difference.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
To South Africa now, and Tusholo Splash Motong produces color splashed art. Motong's work is inspired by his grandmother, who used to sell vegetables and did some basic sewing. Splash is an example of young South Africans who do not let challenges and difficulties put them down. As a qualified fashion designer, he fuses design with his art as he portrays African women. Here's CGTN's Yolisa Njamela.
Splash's work is a true reflection of his upbringing, and he loves to incorporate the ordinary life in Soweto and Johannesburg in his artwork. Splash discovered his creativity and artistic potential at a young age. As a colorful artist, he relishes using bright colors.
My work is really inspired by local scenes, from I do cityscapes like these, whether it's trains, township shacks, four-roomed houses. I take it to the city. I got bright cityscapes. I got these dark ones during the night. So mostly I reflect on Joburg because I was born and raised in Soweto, which has a rich history of, because I used to supply the Joburg with the migrant labor. I use a lot of color because I believe color it's like a spice of life.
He tells us that he uses recycled fabric and newspaper collage mixed with acrylic paint to give his work a multifaceted approach to reflect the diversity of Africa and its people.
Also preserve the environment because fabric usually doesn't biodegrade. It's similar to plastic. It takes a long time. So for me, giving them a second life and giving them a new lease of life, it makes the old product into something new, something different.
Splash has a degree in fashion design and has worked for various top designers in Johannesburg. His main inspiration is his grandmother, hence the dominance of women in his artwork.
She was all those pillars in me, so she raised me up from the ground up. I used to learn how to sew. She used to do crafts like knitting and crochet. So that's how I started learning how to working with fabrics and colors and enjoying textures. She didn't scold me when I say, I want to venture in this career.
Whenever he uses fabrics, he ensures that they have African roots.
The shweshwe is usually found among the Sotho. If you go to the Kalanga, they've got their own color. So I'm trying to fuse that in a dress. So I got over 4 different prints from here. From Ghana, I got the shweshwe, I got the Swazi print as well. So you find there's something we didn't find most in a dress, but in art, there's no boundaries.
Splash's work is much admired. He's now venturing into selling his art in art fairs and other such events. And his work is proving to be quite popular. Yolisa Njamela for CGTN in Johannesburg, South Africa.
Now built at the start of the 20th century by a Belgian millionaire, Egypt's historic Baron Palace is expected to be open to the public once again before the end of the year. But the restoration process has been marked by controversy. Here's CGTN's Daniela Pearson.
The Baron Palace in Egypt was built over 100 years ago in Cairo's district of Heliopolis by one of its richest residents. Deciding to retire from his worldly travels, the Belgian aristocrat Edouard Empin actually established the entire district of Heliopolis. The palace is now undergoing extensive renovations to bring the historical landmark back to its 20th century glory.
We have now completed approximately 90% of the renovation. We're finishing up. A few months, God willing, and we will open this palace up. It would hopefully be finished by then.
The palace, which was built in 1911, has an Indian architectural style, which its billionaire backer insisted on decorating with the rarest and most luxurious of statues. But pictures of the renovation circulating on social media have caused an uproar. Users are saying that the color used to paint the palace does not match the original shade of its facade, and that its original beauty has been wasted. One restoration specialist explained that the palace's original documents have been carefully studied prior to the renovation process, and that the public criticism stems from rumors.
But of course, the recent uproar that took place on social media is not okay. I tell them this is not acceptable. They have to turn to antiquities specialists in the field like us. We have referred back to documents. The documents are there. We have placed them on display and will exhibit them again soon. We will upload them on the website of the Ministry of Antiquities. They are specific to the Baron Palace.
According to the Minister of Antiquities, the renovations were preceded by thorough studies of the original structure, as well as by meetings that involved both experts and the community.
The civilian community, the government, and the executive committees, all of us, have sat together in meetings which were completely honest and the first of their kind. Why? Because I know how much the Baron Palace means to the residents.
Under the supervision of the Ministry of Antiquities, the renovations draw from a $6 million fund and are expected to be finished in 3 months' time. Daniela Pearson, CGTN.
And now your sports news coming up next. Here's what's ahead. Former world champion Geoffrey Kamworor opts out of the World Athletics Championships.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
Kenya has concluded the first phase of the team selection process to the 2019 IAAF World Championships in Doha next month. An experience